This week's parsha is the most important parsha in the entire Torah. You may ask, why is this week's parsha the most important in the entire Torah? Well, let me tell you. Parsha Vayikra starts the third book of the Torah, and we shift from talking about the building of the Mishkan to what we do inside of it. We read about offerings, lots of kinds of offerings. We have animal offerings and grain offerings. We have sin offerings, peace offerings, and guilt offerings. We have fixed offerings and variable offerings. But none of that is why this is the most important parsha in the Torah. The reason this is the most important parsha is because it teaches us about the burden of leadership. Offerings, korbanot, are at the heart of this week's parsha and much of the book of Vayikra. We read about the offerings that are to be brought when various people commit different kinds of sins. Comparing the language around the offerings for individual sins and the sins of a leader or king, we see something interesting. When talking about individuals, we read over and over, if a person will sin this way, they bring this offering. If a person will sin that way, they bring that offering. But when talking about leaders, we read when a ruler sins. For individuals, we get if, but for rulers, it's when. The Torah seems to be saying that a person might sin, but a ruler will sin. Now, we could read this along the lines of Lord Act and power corrupts. So while an individual may or may not sin, someone in power will become corrupted by that power, leading to almost certain sin. But perhaps the Torah is hinting at something more subtle. And to understand that, we need to turn to Pirkei Avot, chapter 2, verse 2. Those who work for the community should do so for the sake of heaven. Of course, everything you do should always be for the sake of heaven. So why is the work you do for the community worthy of being called out? As Rabbi J. Kelman teaches, the nature of community work is to cause people harm. Whenever you make a decision on the use of shared community resources, you're inherently making a decision that'll benefit some and harm others. Spend funds on a new school instead of building a new hospital. Those with young kids will get benefit, but those requiring health care potentially suffer. This is the nature of all community work. But what gives you the right to make decisions that could have disastrous impact on people's lives? Well, if you're making those decisions for your own sake, that would be a terrible sin. But if you're making the decision for the sake of heaven because you really believe the decisions are good for the entire community, then you're permitted to bear the burden of making them. Okay, so Pirkei Avot tells us that we're allowed to make such decisions as long as we do it for the right reasons. But perhaps this week's parsha is telling us that even if we're making decisions for the right reasons, they still are decisions that cause people harm, and there will be an element of sin in that. Inadvertent, accidental, unintended to be sure, but sin nonetheless. And reading carefully, this seems to be exactly the situation the Torah in this week's parsha is talking about. We read, if a leader of Israel sins and unintentionally commits one of the commandments of the Lord which may not be committed, the key word there being unintentionally. It's not talking about being corrupted by power and sinning intentionally. There's no special privilege a leader gets in that case. They're treated like anyone else who intentionally sins. It's talking about a sin as an unintended consequence of executing your leadership role. Leadership is a privilege and a responsibility. Even when making decisions for the sake of heaven, the impact of those decisions can weigh heavily on the leader. At least they should if the leader takes their role seriously. The Torah acknowledges that when this happens, you may feel distanced from Hashem, but then provides the antidote. Bring a korban, from the root karev, to bring near. While we may not have access to korbanot today, the message is clear. The way for leaders to lighten their load is to do mitzvot that bring them near to Hashem. That's one reason why this is the most important parsha in the entire Torah. But the other reason is that the most important piece of Torah is whatever piece of Torah you have in front of you right now. Shabbat Shalom and Am Yisroel Chai.